everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Wisdom Words podcast, where each week we talk to folks who have stories, advice, and life hacks, all of which take you one step closer to that feeling of hope. I'm your co-host, Neil Chiretti.
And I am your co-host, Rini O'Day.
Today, we have someone very special with us, a very special guest that we've been interacting for a while, trying to fix times, dates, had a pre-Zoom session a few weeks ago, and it was so wonderful. We have Burnout recovery coach, Elizabeth Collins.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Elizabeth. Hi, Eliza. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Rini?
Yeah.
Neil?
I'm getting better. I am.
Good.
It's a long process, a long haul.
Yeah, let's start a little bit with your background. I know burnout is something that anybody and everybody faces in their lives, and probably more often than they'd like to admit. So how did you become a burnout coach? What was it about this, that area that grabbed your attention?
I burnt out. And I got real good at it.
That's
I was like, I am like varsity level valedictorian good at burnout. Like I too have the perfectionist gene. So when I show up, I go all the way. So I started my business.
You're valedictorian of your college?
I'm the valedictorian of burnout, yes.
One
of them. I think I share the mantle with a handful of people. But
Sure.
But I started my business, my acupuncture practice in 2014, and I am an acupuncturist. I graduated from acupuncture school. I didn't graduate from business school. And so acupuncture too is not the kind of medical track in most cases where you graduate and you join a practice. There are a lot of people who graduate from sort of Western or industrial medicine programs that you can be a PCP under somebody else and you can eventually take over their practice or what the case may be. You join an office, you join a practice, you join a group. Acupuncture is still, it's new enough in the Western culture, particularly in America, where we don't have really big complexes and practices like that. So most people who graduate start their own business. So I didn't become an acupuncturist with the intention of becoming an entrepreneur. I didn't have that sort of entrepreneurial spirit. Yes.
I recommend people get acupuncture. It really is a great thing. And I recommend people call Eliza to do it. There you go. Okay,
Thank you very much. I appreciate the endorsement. I always say that everybody needs acupuncture, but I'm horribly biased. But yeah, so I didn't have an entrepreneurial spirit, and I was like, I want to run my own business. I was like, I want to be an acupuncturist. And the best way to do that we know how, that we were taught, is to own your own business. So I didn't graduate from business school. I don't have that background in I don't have a business oriented brain or body. And it's really not an interest of mine, but it was a means to an end for what I wanted to do. So I very much built that bridge as I crossed it. Or I should say crossed that bridge as I built it. And I learned to do all the things. I learned how to be an insurance biller. I learned how to be a receptionist. I'd already done administrative work. So like I knew how to do some of the administrative aspects. I had to be the marketer. I had to be the person who did networking. I had to do everything for myself because I was just starting out and I couldn't afford to hire a VA or a biller or a team of people. And I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to curate my business because I was just told that these steps, A, B, C, D, are what you do to build a practice. So that's what I did. Sure. I tried to eventually build up to where I was running multiple rooms so that I could see multiple clients per hour, which is very common. I was kind of doing all of this work myself. And I also have a spectacular case of imposter syndrome. And I'm already continuing education junkie. Like I love continuing education. I love learning. So
knowledge is power, people.
Knowledge is power, ignorance is bliss. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. I deal with that quite a bit. But the more I learned, the more I felt like I didn't know. So the more I felt like I had to learn. And it became this sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy of continuing education, addiction and always feeling like no matter what I knew, it wasn't enough. And over the course of about 5 years, that just compounded to where I didn't have the mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual energy to continue like that. And I really started to just resent having to run a business. I love my patients and I love doing acupuncture, but I was resenting the business parts of doing this. It wasn't fun for me anymore. I felt like the continuing education was just something that I was doing as opposed to something that I was reveling in. And I really kind of lost it towards mid 2019. A company that I contracted with who sent me a lot of work kind of stopped referring out wholesale. So it wasn't something personally with me that they were like, oh, we don't think you're a good acupuncturist, we don't want to send people to you. They kind of restructured internally. So they stopped referring to a lot of people. So they refer to acupuncturists and chiropractors and massage therapists. And they just kind of shut that down wholesale. And half of my practice was based on that. And so that kind of gutted me almost overnight. And I called a colleague of mine who had started very successful practices, 2 separate ones in Europe, from scratch when she didn't even know the language when she started practicing. And I said, how did you do this? How did you grow this little empire that you had? And she said, oh, I burned out. And you're burnt out. And we're going to fix that. So that's what we started to address. And in the process of recovering from burnout, I identified my values as an individual and brought those to my business. And I discovered that I was not running my business in a way that was sustainable for me and who I am as a person. I was doing it based on what everybody else said a quote unquote successful business looks like. And that was one of the things that was really kind of crushing me and weighing me down. And so I had to restructure how I approach my business. And, the pandemic has been awful, but I had 14 weeks off at the beginning of it. And when I came back, I was able to take advantage of the fact that I could fully restructure the way I wanted to run a practice. And that's what I did. And so the subsequent, 2.5 years has been identifying the places where I was behaving in such a way that it burnt me out and adjusting that in kind of a stepwise manner as I encounter each challenge.
Well, it kind of makes sense because the number one burnout is a physician. And you were, in a sense, a physician because, you dealt with people medically, in a sense. And, so I can understand.
But interestingly, it wasn't the physician piece of that burnt me out. It was the entrepreneurship. And that's the really interesting thing about, the world of burnout is, particularly for entrepreneurs, we understand things like physician burnout and corporate burnout and, things like that. The world of entrepreneurship at the time that I was experiencing this didn't have architecture around how to recover. And so my burnout coach, Kate Donovan, literally wrote the book on burnout recovery. One of them, she wrote a book called The Bounce Back Ability Factor. And she's a nerd and a research junkie like I am. So she literally went to the research and said, what is everything that we know about burnout? And then how does this apply to me as an individual? Because she burnt out as well. And that's how she recovered, was figuring out what this looks like coming from an entrepreneurial space and the ways in which burnout recovery is different from burnout prevention. So she teased a lot of that out and has been very adamant about creating a culture that is supportive of people in non-traditional spaces who experience burnout. Because you can burn out doing anything. You can burn out being a stay-at-home parent. And I would challenge anybody who has talked to a stay-at-home parent in the last 2 years in particular of trying to work from home or just, basically become a teacher. You can burn out as an entrepreneur. You can burn out in corporate. So burnout is a much more pervasive concept and experience than we historically know it as.
Like listening to your podcasts while you drive, go jogging, cook, and just go about your day? Subscribe and listen to us on platforms like Anchor, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Have you subscribed?
Can we promote your friend's book? Let's promote your friend's book.
Yeah, okay, I can send you guys links for everything too if you want to put everything in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll put it on the show too.
The description of the episode. So,
absolutely. Yeah. It's called The Bounce Back Ability Factor, and it's by Kate Donovan, and she spells her name CAIT.
How is, especially from a burnout coach, how do you define burnout? I realize that could be very open-ended. And as you said, different situations, different people have different ways. But what happens to us, especially psychologically, when we're burnt out by something?
That's a really good question. And burnout does tend to, because it's a fairly new concept to us, it's not a new experience for people, but it's making its way more into the mainstream now. So there is kind of an evolution of how it's defined and what it looks like as we learn more about it. But one of the ways that I think about it is I often compare it to depression, because people are like, how do I know if I'm depressed or burnt out? And
they are
those
hand
two
in
things,
hand, aren't they?
those two things can go together, but not necessarily. So when I experienced burnout, I have a history of depression. So I was burnt out and depressed. When my coach went through it, she does not have a history of depression. So she was burnt out, but she was not depressed. So there can be overlap, but it's not essential that they show up together.
Can burnout make you depressed?
It can. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there are some physiological things that can contribute to that as well that we can dig into in a little bit. But one of the things that I usually say is that, like, often depression usually feels like a weighted blanket, emotionally speaking. It kind of just, it affects everything in your life. Whereas with burnout, that might be specific to something. So for me, I felt really good in my relationships and with my friendships and with my social circle, but work was really kind of running me ragged. And
you had that blanket on you.
And so like it wasn't the weighted blanket because of my history of depression. It eventually became that, where it affected everything, and I didn't have the energy to engage with my friends and all of that. That leaned more towards depression. But burnout often shows up in a specific place. So you can feel really good in a bunch of different aspects of your life, and you can also love what you do, but be burnt out by it. Whereas something like depression really just kind of like weighs down on everything. So that's one of the ways that I differentiate it for people, to give them an idea of whether or not it's depression, burnout, or both.
I get it. Okay. Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
That was actually going to be one of my questions, is that could you go into a little bit about how burnout can happen even on endeavors you love, or journeys that seemingly like, well, I have a job that I love. It's my dream job. So I shouldn't, why am I tired of it? Or why is it burning me out? Or even spending times, you mentioned, like, it can affect to where you don't want to spend time with family and friends, even though normally we'd be like, well, we get along with so-and-so is my best friend, so why am I avoiding them? Or why is this? So can you go into like how burnout can affect even things that on paper seemingly you love to do, or it's your passion, or,
A lot of that has to do with boundaries. And there is this phrase that I absolutely hate, that is, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. Girl, I work twice as hard because I love what I do. And it's harder for me to create healthy boundaries around that. When you're so passionate about what you do that you can throw yourself at it and take on more responsibility than you need to, or fail to outsource or delegate things that could be delegated to provide more energy to take care of yourself, that's the space where burnout happens. I was literally just talking to a client today, and we were talking about time management. And he said, I have the time, but I'm either doing things all the time or I'm recovering. And I said, then you don't have the time, because you're doing one of two things. You don't have any, that's not white space. Recovery isn't white space where you just get to be and exist. And he was like, oh my God, that's so smart. And I was like, I know, I need to write it down. Like, when these things come up, I'm like, oh my God, like twice a year I say smart things and I need to write it down. But that is kind of the habit that we get into of, there is a culture around, particularly entrepreneurship, that if you love what you do, you should be throwing yourself at it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and dreaming about it even when you're asleep. And there's also this idea that you have to hustle, you have to put in that much energy, or you're not really working. And so people tend to not create healthy boundaries around their work life and the rest of their life. When we're talking specifically about work or entrepreneurial burnout, when it comes to like familial burnout, that's a whole different ballgame. But both of those things still require boundaries. So for me, when I first started out, I would answer text messages. If somebody wanted an appointment and they texted me at 8 p.m. on a Sunday, I would answer, because I was a new little green baby business owner. And I was worried that if I didn't get back to them within 24 hours or the same day, they would go someplace else. Not even realizing
this is when
I
you
was
were
running a
a
medical
acupuncturist?
practice. Yes, this was my medical practice. No medical practice, unless it's like a psychiatrist who has emergency hours, you know, like an emergency line where if you're having a psychiatric emergency, you can call this person. That nobody needs an on-call acupuncturist, at least not where I live. So like, why was I doing this? And I would get frustrated that my phone was pinging at 8 p.m. on a Sunday. It's not that person's responsibility. They get to text me whenever they want. It's my responsibility to log out of the app or shut my phone off or put it on do not disturb. So it was my responsibility to create those boundaries. So a lot of times when people burn out saying like, I'm doing what I love, I don't understand why I now hate it so much. It's because you're not creating internal boundaries that give you the space to separate enough from that business to have a life outside of it.
Right.
Let's talk about internal boundaries. That is a great question. I mean, that's a great, thing to go into. So how do you create those? What do you do? I mean,
first you start to notice where you need them. And resentment can be a very useful emotion for that. And that's what was popping up for me on that Sunday night when somebody would text me. I'd be like, ugh, like, why? Ew, go away. Like, why am I resentful of this person? And so that's a moment where at the time, in 2014, I didn't have the wherewithal to ask those questions of myself. So curiosity about your own internal environment is very, very useful through this process. But when you start to feel that resentment, ask yourself why. And is it something the other person is doing? Is it something that something outside of you is doing to you? Or is it something where you can set an internal boundary and say, I'm not going to check my email except twice a day, or I'm going to put my phone on do not disturb? Are there actions that you can take that will make the situation feel better and reduce your stress? That's where an internal boundary exists. External boundaries we have to set like with other people. But more often than not, I find with people who experience burnout, all sorts of boundaries aren't good. And we're often not taught about internal boundaries. So
so that's
I mean,
I had
a place
never
that we
really
start.
heard that.
Yeah.
I had never heard that before. And I love that. I do. I mean, you have to start inside with yourself, and if you're not willing to help yourself, no one is going to be helped.
Right. Exactly. And if you can't set boundaries with yourself, forget about trying to set them with other people.
Because it's sad if you really have a passion to do something and then you're so burnt out, you just can't do it. That's the most difficult thing in the world.
Yeah.
Because you want to, and your mind is telling you, do it, but you don't have the steps, to do it.
Well, and if your mind is telling you do it, and not rest somewhere in there, that's a recipe for burnout, and so we can't go. We are not these endlessly charged batteries that can go and go and go and go and go. Something that we talk about all the time in Eastern medicine is life is cyclical. Everything works on a cycle. We have, diurnal cycles over the course of 24 hours. Like we talk about cortisol being a stress hormone and everybody's like, my cortisol is high. Sometimes your cortisol is supposed to spike in the morning and then slowly taper off in the afternoon and evening so that you can sleep at night. And as that tapers off, your melatonin is supposed to go up. So we have a daily cycle. We have, women have monthly cycles, men have them too, just not the same way. We have annual cycles, we have seasons. And so when we're in this constant hustle culture, we're not honoring all of our seasons, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, over the course of a life.
Who's more burnout, men or women?
That's hard to say. I primarily work with women. That's just tends to who gravitates to me with the type of work that I do. Okay. But I believe that burnout is incredibly prevalent in men. And I have no research to back this up. This is just an opinion and an observation, but I feel it's almost similarly to the way that like we believe that men can't experience domestic abuse the same way that women do. I believe it's probably a much bigger problem than we're talking about, and it probably hasn't gotten the spotlight it deserves. So there are men, oh God, I'm dropping off. Jim something. I'll find it for the comments for any men who are listening to this who are just like, yeah, I'm really resonating with this and I need to talk to somebody and I'd love a dude. There are men in the burnout recovery community that's starting to become a thing. So I think it probably equally affects both sexes, and it's just a matter of how it's being addressed at any given point in time and who's doing the work. A lot of the coaches and people that I know are women. And so that I think is where it tends to show up. And I think women have also historically been encouraged to care for themselves more over the last 10, 15, 20 years. The self-care movement tends to be driven by and for women. Right. So I think it's something, I think that men are probably a highly underserved group.
To use.
Yeah.
So much is out there, information, or that's the burnout happening across all genders, across all types of people. But maybe the issue is just not being talked about. And I also know that you have this tendency, you like to talk about things that generally we shy away from. This is something I heard from your other podcasts, especially on Sarah's podcast, about things like grief and death. And so can you talk about why is that so crucial that we talk about it when generally it's taboo? No, don't talk about that. That's bad. That brings me down. The need for that, and why is that so important that we address it more directly than we generally do as a society?
These are inherent emotions from an evolutionary perspective. And so when we shy away from these types of things, we literally deny aspects of who we are. And I'm not saying that we want to live in grief. Like, don't build a condo there. I say that with like burnout too. And my coach talks about sitting in the muck. You know, like if you're having a crappy day, can I curse on here? Is that okay?
Yes.
If you're having a shitty day, because crappy does not always, you know, with burnout, like it doesn't always, I'm also just a sweary person. I like it. But if you're having a shitty day, trying to spiritually bypass your way out of it short circuits the stress completion cycle of like your stress. Like we have, again, it's this cyclical thing. If you watch a rabbit get chased by a fox and the rabbit gets away, because I like happy endings, you're going to watch the rabbit kind of chill out for a minute and then it shakes its whole body and then it bounces off. It doesn't do that just because it's scared. What it does is that action actually releases the adrenaline. It helps literally shake off the adrenaline, and it completes the stress cycle. So when we don't engage with these emotions of frustration or anger or grief or rage, and we say, I shouldn't feel like that, or I'm going through a really stressful time, but I should be so grateful for what I have. Gratitude and resentment are not mutually exclusive. They can exist at the same time. I had a friend who was going through a really tough time at work. She's also an entrepreneur, and she had this really great opportunity to like go on a trip and do this thing. And she said, I know I should just be grateful for that. And I told her, they're not mutually exclusive. You can be very grateful for what you have and very frustrated by what you're experiencing at the same time. We're complex enough individuals at this point. We've evolved to be able to do that. And if all you do is focus on gratitude, you're bottling up these emotions that are eventually going to manifest as headaches, neck pain, stomach issues. Like all of that affects the body. And so I really love digging into things like grief, because once you have permission to fully experience that, you can actually get through it instead of having this kind of pop up at the back of your head anytime you're least expecting it. You have a bad day and you have a 5-alarm meltdown and you're bawling in a Target parking lot. I don't know her from personal experience at all. Raise his hand emoji. Like, but that's the thing. Like, this stuff sneaks up on you if you don't deal with it at the time. And so you don't want to, like I said, build a condo there, but give yourself permission to feel it, because you move through it that way.
I am one that feels emotion. And I believe everybody needs to feel emotion. If you're happy, be happy. If you're having a shitty day, cry. Throw things. That we are individuals that need to express who we are and what we're dealing with. Why would the universe have given us, the power to do these things, so you have to express yourself, is my point.
Yeah. And it's funny. I was an emergency medical technician for a while. And so I got really good at compartmentalizing. I was pretty good at that by the time that I got there. But when you're an EMT, you are dealing with people at their worst and or most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You cannot bring your shit to the table. And so I got real good at compartmentalizing. I remember when I was in school, I was going through a breakup. And I was at my internship, my acupuncture internship. And on my lunch break, I was crying. And my professor, who's now a friend of mine, was like, "Do you need to go home?" And I said, "No, I need to sit here for 10 minutes and cry. And then I'm going to clean up my face. I'm going to splash some water on myself. I'm going to go back in there. I'm going to do my job." And he looked at me and he was like, "Okay." And now when I have really bad days, like if something happens and I'm like, I need to emotionally take care of myself, I'm in a position to be able to give myself permission to do that. But I take a much more clear approach to my barometer. And I say, do I have the wherewithal to go to work today or do I not? Do I really need to stay home? Because my patients are wonderful people and they always understand. And they want me to take care of myself, because when I take care of myself, I show up better for them. So there are days now where I know, okay, this is a situation that I can compartmentalize and go to work, versus taking my own internal temperature and saying, this is a situation where I can't or don't want to compartmentalize, and I don't have to. But knowing that, going through enough of that emotion and giving myself permission to feel it, whether or not I express it in that moment, regardless of what I'm doing, is something that I learned throughout the course of therapy and burnout recovery and just becoming an adult. That's not to be like a total nihilist about it, but like life is trauma. Like that's, plants don't grow out of the ground without confronting the soil that's on top of them. So trauma is growth, but it doesn't have to be stored. Recovery, burnout is not your fault. It's not your fault.
Right.
Recovering from it is your responsibility.
Can we go into that, the initial steps to burnout recovery, and, like you many years ago, having to recognize what are the steps to taking that? I mean, aside from the usual, find someone like you, like a burnout coach and all that, what are some things people can do to, recognize, okay, this is burnout, and the initial steps to solving that and coming to terms with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And alcohol and drugs are not on this prescription list.
They're not on the prescription list. However, in burnout recovery, we don't demonize people's coping mechanisms, because there's already enough shame around the way that people cope. So like if people come home, I've had clients come home and say, I can't unwind without 2 glasses of wine at the end of the night. And I have so much shame about talking about it. So we don't demonize that. Okay. So do you want to change it? Yes. All right. Then we'll give you resources to change it moving forward. But we're not going to say you're a bad person for utilizing it. And however long it takes you to engage with that stuff, everybody's journey is different. So the process of burnout recovery is really making sure that there is space held for however you have to show up for yourself, and that there's no shame around that. And part of the identification piece, we've already talked a little bit about that, but specifically for symptoms with burnout, I don't think we've really gotten into. So some of the things that you may be experiencing, in addition to like the feelings of resentment and frustration, brain fog can be a really big one. Feeling like you're not banging at 100, banging on all cylinders and working at 100%.
It's San Francisco Bay in here.
Yeah.
It's San Francisco Bay.
Exactly. It's just burnout comes around 2 p.m. But until then I'm useless. Insomnia is a big one too. Feeling tired but wired. So you get to the end of the day and you're absolutely wrecked, and you go to lay down and you just have a laundry list of shit like banging around in your head that won't let you turn off. Or you wake up multiple times a night, or you wake up at like 4 a.m. and you can't go back to sleep. So sleep interruption tends to be a big one. Gastrointestinal changes, people who can't digest food the way that they used to, or they just feel kind of like bloated and terrible all the time. At the worst of my burnout, I basically felt like an overstuffed sausage the whole time. It felt like my skin was going to split because I just couldn't digest my food. Because when we're in this constant fight or flight, we're not allowing our body to engage in the rest and digest the parasympathetic nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
You may find that your exercise recovery is reduced. So somebody who's very keen on doing like a lot of HIIT training, or, you know, cardio training, or what's the other one? CrossFit, you know, these really high intensity workouts, you find that you might get injured a lot more frequently, or you need a nap every time you work out. Or your workout recovery is worse. So like when you could do a workout every, you know, a high intensity workout every other day, you're only getting 1 or 2 a weekend because your body can't handle it. These are the types of things that you may see from a symptomatic perspective. And as far as recovery goes, burnt out brains actually shrink. And I know that sounds super scary because they can grow back. But stress causes your brain to shrink. And it disrupts the connection between the left and right hemisphere. I think at my worst, it was probably the size of a pencil eraser.
Oh no!
But it also causes the connection between the left and right hemispheres to disrupt. So the things that we do for burnout prevention that are often recommended for burnout, like exercise and meditation, are not useful for burnt out brains because the brain and the body don't have the resources for it. So we start with seemingly small, really simple steps that sound so stupid, but make a massive impact. So instead of trying to meditate, do a very short, and when I say short, I mean like 60-second guided meditation or breathing exercise. Just stop for 60 seconds and take 4 deep breaths. And when you do that, don't just breathe in and out. Actually focus on relaxing your body. Like we carry tension in our jaw and in our shoulders, and even in like the muscles around our eyes. As you breathe, progressively work on relaxing that body, and just do that for 60 seconds a few times a day. Because when we're in this fight or flight constantly, our bodies don't recognize rest as safe. So to slow down and to rest actually feels extraordinarily unsafe. So we need to do this in really small incremental ways that make the body feel safe again. So breathing for 60 seconds at a time, and then slowly working your way up to 2 minutes a couple times a day, something like that. Yoga Nidra is extraordinarily useful for burnt out brains because there's evidence that in Yoga Nidra.
What is that?
What it is it sounds like it's yoga, but you don't move. You basically get to lay on your back and relax. And it's a form of progressive relaxation. So you can find guided meditations that will walk you through it. And they have you focus on specific aspects of your body. So like thumb, index finger, middle finger. And so you'll go through your fingers and then your hand and your wrist and your forearm, and you'll focus on relaxing each of those as the person talks about that. It brings you into your body. It gives you a somatic sensory awareness. So it reconnects the brain and the body. And it's a passive way of helping all of that like neurobiological wiring regrow. And it's also super relaxing. They do a lot. There are a lot of yoga nidras for sleep. So it's a really nice thing to do as you kind of drift off for the night, because it helps your brain and your body. But it's a very kind of like, it's passive. I like to call it passive, but active. So you're not physically doing anything, but you are engaging in a process that also, because burnt out brains have a really hard time focusing, someone is focusing your attention for you. So you're getting help to do that. You're not trying to hack all of this yourself. So that can be a really useful way. And then one of the other things that we say, I think the third thing is we've got breathing, we've got Yoga Nidra. Change your environment. If you don't like where you
we're
are,
moving to Hawaii.
that can work. But again, with burnout, we start small. Do you like the coffee mug that you drink out of? Does it make you happy? Every time you look at it, does your face light up? You're like, I love that coffee mug. I have 2 coffee mugs at home. A friend of mine got them because she knows my personality well enough. One of them says, fuck this. And one of them says, fuck that. And
I love that.
They're handcrafted. They're beautiful. They're handcrafted ceramics. I'll send you guys the link. You can put it in the show notes. But they're handcrafted ceramics and they're beautiful. And I love them. Every time I drink my coffee out of it, I'm like, that's me in a coffee mug. Like, that is me. I have my Yeti right here. It's a beautiful color.
Oh yeah.
It makes me happy.
It is
so when
color.
we are around things that make us happy, whether it's the sheets that you sleep on, the coffee mug that you drink out of, the art on your walls, the color of your walls, if you are in a space that you like, it is a space where you feel safe. And if you feel safe, your brain can come offline more easily and you can engage with more difficult things eventually. So if you curate an environment that feels good, that's not taking up brain space. If you don't like your coffee mug and every time you look at it, you're like, I hate that coffee mug. That's something that you think about that's a negative thought that is invading space that does not need to exist there. So start by changing small things. If you can, get a nice coffee mug. What products do you use in the shower? Clutter. Are you just using like random shampoo, or do you have a shampoo that you love, or a soap that smells really, really good? We can luxuriate in ways that we don't even realize because we don't give ourselves permission to focus on the small things. So as you start to tweak small things and just go about your day in a more enjoyable way, you're just so much less likely to feel overwhelmed by your environment and therefore anything else that you interact with. So those are three basic ways that you can kind of start burnout recovery without having to engage with somebody like me.
And get rid of clutter.
And then you're the fourth, right? You're the fourth. Find out Eliza.
She's the fourth. Yeah.
I'm there when you want to level up. Yeah.
So one thing I found really interesting, we touched briefly on this when we had a Zoom chat in the beginning, is your use of tarot cards, right? Because you have had conventional uses of them, like we talked about, but you also use them in a very unconventional way, ways that somebody who thinks about tarot cards probably, and maybe the only image that comes to most people's minds is voodoo or new generation, all that
crystal ball.
What television shows us.
Right. And you do a little bit of the traditional way, but you also have another more modern method of utilizing them. So can you talk about that? How do you utilize tarot cards in the 21st century manner?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, I really kind of love the way that this evolved for me because I am somebody who has one foot firmly in science and one foot firmly in spirituality. And those things seem like they're mutually exclusive or contradictory.
I think that's how it should be.
They're actually the same thing, but that's the next podcast.
Yes.
That's the next podcast.
Yeah. That's what we're going to get into. Yeah, next episode.
But the way that I started utilizing tarot in a much more functional way, I call it the practicality of tarot, is tarot cards are just representations of archetypes and situations. So you don't have to interpret them literally. So when a tarot card comes up, the Three of Swords, for example, is one that I use a lot as an example. That's a card about heartbreak. It doesn't mean you're going to get a divorce. When you pull a card and you have sort of an intention or idea of what you're talking about, if I'm talking about my business, where am I experiencing heartbreak in my business? Am I not showing up for myself? Am I putting energy into something that I don't feel good about, that's out of alignment with my values? Am I putting energy into something that I was really passionate about but doesn't seem to be panning out and I just have to let go of and grieve a little bit? So it's more of a thought exercise as opposed to a divination tool. I'm not doing it to tell my future of how my business is going to turn out. I'm pulling cards and doing a single card or a spread to get an idea of what's going on inside of me that I might not even be paying attention to. So I'll do this with my clients. I'll pull a card before they even come on for the day. And we'll say, the Tower comes up. Okay, the Tower is about destruction, largely speaking. And people are always like, I hated this card. It was my least favorite card in the deck when I was 19 years old and I was a baby. And now that I'm 40, I'm like, this is my favorite card because
you look good for 40.
Thank you.
You really do.
I have good genetics and I think I'm pickled. I like wine. So
that's what I call my son.
But when you look at the Tower from a more mature perspective, it's not just everything's awful. It's tearing everything down and creating fertile soil for something else to grow. So when that comes up, if I'm talking to a client and they're like, this isn't working, I don't know what to do. I'm like, cool. How would you feel if we just burned the whole thing down? Like, you don't have to answer yes or no, but what do you feel when I say that? what does that fit? Is if the first thing is super excited, it's like, cool, this is a starting point. And so it creates an opportunity for thoughtful conversations, as opposed to just saying, I'm doing a spread, this is what's going to happen with your business or your future or your life.
Okay, so when we think of burnout, we think of job, right? What are other parts of the human anatomy and mind and body and whatever do we get burned out from? Like social media? What else?
Social media definitely contributes. If people have chronic health problems, that will lead to burnout in a heartbeat. It's incredibly difficult to deal with chronic health problems day after day, year after year. Functional medicine is one of the other things that I do, and functional coaching for that reason, is because if we're just addressing the brain and we're not addressing imbalances in the body, like small intestine bacterial overgrowth or hormone imbalances or, autoimmune stuff, you can do as much mindset work as you want, but if your body is out of balance, that's not going to stick. So health is someplace that people can burn out. And like I said, relationships and parenthood. And that requires a lot of open, honest conversation and boundaries, knowing your own internal boundaries, setting, developing healthy boundaries is usually a conversation. So there are multiple places that we can burn out that aren't just work. But I think in a lot of cases, the response is the same. The health piece of it, you do need to work with a doctor or functional medicine practitioner, naturopath, osteopath, whatever the case may be, to tackle some of that. But from the emotional perspective, boundaries and values will serve you very well regardless of where you are, and not violating other people's boundaries. We have a tendency to want to do that under the guise of helping, and it's like people don't need us to necessarily. That's my coach has an exercise called the knot, and she said, imagine a net over the whole world, and at each point where there's a junction where there's a knot, that's a person. Your job is to hold up your knot. Your job is not to go over and help somebody else support theirs, because if you do that, you're abandoning your knot, and then the whole net sags. So take care of your own stuff. Tend your own garden. I don't need to come into Neil's garden. Maybe he's growing flowers and I come in and I plant a bunch of tomatoes and he's like, I don't even eat nightshades. Why are you here? Like, you don't need my help. Trust people to, if they ask for help, that's something different. But if somebody's not asking for help, don't go in and create essentially a problem that they don't need. Trust individuals to be their own people. That's another way of keeping healthy boundaries, is by not violating somebody else's.
Unless they ask. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And in that case, that's invited, and they're asking you. So that's not a violation.
You are a burnout coach. How can people get a hold of you? How, can you do it just online? Like someone in California wanted you? Yes.
So most of my clients are online. You can find me at www.theburnoutwitch.com. And you can also follow me. The Burnout Witch.
You are so adorable.
And
I absolutely love that.
I'm usually doing some form of jackassery on Instagram. My handle is the Burnout Witch there as well. Yeah. No, I'm very much about like humor and comedy, and making burnout recovery accessible and fun.
Great sense of humor.
Thank you.
I appreciate sense of humor. This has been one of my favorite conversations we've ever had. Because people do get burnt out.
That means a lot to me. This has been such a blast. Thank you guys too for doing this. Like, you're bringing things to the forefront, and you're asking big, hard questions about, dirty topics that not everybody wants to talk about. And that's really important, and it's really meaningful. So thank you for doing this work.
Well, having guests like you makes it so worthwhile.
Possible
it really
to do that.
Does. It does. So.
Thank you.
Anyway.
This has been so fun. So
awesome. Thank you guys. It has for me as well.
And have a great, great weekend.
You too.
Yeah.
We'd like to thank you for joining us today. And we really want to give a special thank you to Eliza for coming on.
It was definitely awesome. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And remember to hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode. Thank you everyone once again, and we will see you right here next week at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Goodbye.
Bye.